welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohen, and today our guests are the world-renowned architects Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. This is the second part of our interview, and our guests in this section will talk about architectural history and critique some trends that have shaped the field of architecture over the past century. Denise, Robert, welcome to the Drexel interview. Welcome back to the Drexel interview. I wondered if we could start by just a very broad question. I wanted you to tell me what buildings, perhaps, of the past, or what architectural styles in the past you most admire.
Well, I am finding that I am loving buildings that are that are not abstract and pure in their aesthetic, and that connect with information giving. And there's a lot of that. The pediment of a Greek or Roman temple has those gods in them, and they're not there just as art. Italian Renaissance buildings have beautiful murals in them. And someone recently has written a book that her thesis is that it's incidental that it's art. They are there mostly for the information they are giving out. And so because we are in the so-called information age, and we are in the post-industrial age, it is very appealing to me to see architecture that is not dependent on the industrial aesthetic and that can give out information via different means on its walls and on
very different from the modernist aesthetic.
Very different from that, and that is we're finding is very thrilling for us to look at again. Then second, and this is the second and last part of it, is something that we mentioned earlier, which is architecture that connects with mannerism, and mannerism is a trend that evolves through time and all history. English historical architecture has lots of mannerism where there is contradiction that is accommodated, and where you acknowledge the rules, but then you break the rules, not frivolously, but you break them as a result of accommodating complexities which are part of life, especially our lives today in the complex world we live in of multiculturalism and very, very quickly changing technology.
Okay. Well, I wonder if in that light you would address what is one of my favorite works of yours, the addition to the National Gallery in London, which was completed in the early 1990s, and which I think does a lot of the things you're saying. I mean, that building was, or that addition was completed, I think, after a great deal of controversy beforehand about previous designs, and the famous statement by Prince Charles about an earlier proposal that he thought it was, he called it a carbuncle on the face of a dear friend. This was a design before yours, obviously. And then you created this wonderful addition that seems to flow naturally out of the existing National Gallery, but is also totally different and modern. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. I don't know which of you feels most comfortable, and also perhaps some of the sociological and political issues that surrounded.
Why don't I start on that, because on the architectural, and then you get into the more also
political,
architectural,
sociological.
well, also sociological and the other. But very quickly, the building that you refer to has been. Lots of people like it, but also it has been controversial, and it's easy in its mannerism. Let's say it is not easy to define. The modernists don't like it because it's not modernist, and let's say the traditionalists don't like it because it's not historically revivalist enough, as it were. And we rather like the fact that there's this kind of ambiguity. And it is a building which, in its composition, next to the original building, built in the 1830s, our building is inflecting toward the old building. Actually, it's inflecting this way toward the old building in its composition, and it.
What do you mean when you say? I love that term. Inflecting.
Well, the composition of the building is that it isn't just it isn't sitting alone as a whole. when you read it, you have to read it as a part of something beyond it. And I think the idea of bowing towards something is an indication of that. And so there are elements on the facade that are exact replications of the classical elements on the old building, but they are used in a different way. The rhythm of the elements, especially the pilasters, is the rhythm of jazz music, whereas the rhythm of the original building is the rhythm of the gavotte or the minuet or something like that.
That's terrific.
And then the entrance to the building is a great big hole in the building, because it is accommodating millions of people a year rather than just thousands a year. In the old days when the building was built, just gentlemen went there. And then
was all this very conscious to you?
Oh,
were
yeah,
you conscious of these sorts of metaphors?
Thinking of this at the time, that helped us in it. And then the interior is one where the light is very important, to have the lighting, which has to be not too brilliant, but also be appropriate. And that's another big subject.
Okay. Do you have anything to add, Denise?
Well, again, the notion of learning from the environment and learning from the building itself and entering deeply into the situation there and deriving the new building from the old and also not from the old. This mixture of both of those that we did, understanding its context on Trafalgar Square, but also it spans over a pedestrian pathway that leads to Leicester Square. So it's really held between the two squares, and it sits in a tissue of the city, which is, the basis of it was medieval. Yeah. So all of these helped us, again, evolve from within the problem, its own solution. But then it's some of the most precious painting in the world.
Yes.
And also it's very intimate paintings, mother and child paintings, which is Madonna and the baby Jesus, and very small in scale. And if you've been in one of those European galleries on a Sunday afternoon, people go by in a phalanx, 15 abreast. Yeah. And so each one has to have a personal relationship with at least one painting, let's hope more than one. Yeah. So you have to think very hard about how to plan it as a very efficient system for getting people through it, and yet in such a way that they can also have a sense of quiet and intimacy with the paintings. It took a lot of thought of how to do both those things.
I can imagine. I spent a lot of time there last year, and now that you mention it, we tend to think of the building on the outside, and of course it is a museum, and it is so easy to look at the paintings in that structure. And obviously that was what you were thinking of.
And we were in a lot of galleries where I said, it feels like it's about to start raining in here. Yeah. And said, how do we make it not feel like that? And that, what looks like clerestory lighting high up in the walls of the gallery is in fact an opening to a lot of machinery. It lets in a natural light and electrical light and modulates it according to the time of day and the amount of light available. Its effect is to make people think those galleries are quite bright, although they maintain the right standards for protecting the paintings. And that's quite a feat to achieve both those things. The result was people thought the paintings had all been cleaned.
I did.
They weren't.
I felt that way.
They weren't.
The Raphaels, I couldn't believe how bright they were.
Yes. It's just because of the lighting.
So interesting. Well, anyway, let me switch gears a little bit and talk about something slightly different. You two met at the University of Pennsylvania. You were both on the faculty there. And I read somewhere that Denise, Robert was, I don't know if he'd met you before, but he was taken with you, perhaps, when you gave a speech about, the subject was saving the Frank Furness Library at Penn from demolition. And you gave an impassioned speech, and of course the building was saved. And I don't know if it's true that he fell in love with you at that moment. He can address that or not as he pleases. But I wondered if you could perhaps talk about the meeting, but also about your views from then on about preservation and renovation and that whole issue, which of course has become increasingly important.
Let me mention first,
Yeah.
it actually was a faculty club, a faculty meeting.
Okay.
And Denise, it was her first faculty meeting. She had just been a student before that. And they were discussing, should the department take a stand on this? It's hard to believe now. And she made this very impressive and courageous statement. Afterwards, I went up and said, I want to introduce myself. My name is Robert Venturi, and I agree with everything you said. And her first words to me were, well, why didn't you say something? So it's been that way ever since.
I get it. Now I see the whole relationship in that.
Yeah.
So you had not met before, but you knew of each other before?
Well, yes, I'd known her, I'd seen her as a student, which she had been a student, but she never had been a student of mine. But I would just mention very quickly, in that era, there was not an interest very much in saving among architects in historical and historical preservation. Now, it's perhaps too much that very often the preservation is a bit fanatically saying, hey, you can't tear that building down because
it's old.
Because it's old. And by the way, the other one is saying, hey, we're putting something very important there in terms of the context of the neighborhood that it's in and the institution that it's part of, or whatever.
So you're not for saving.
So
just
it's
for the
again
sake of
complex.
saving. Yeah.
It's very complex, and very often when your ideas are accepted, then maybe that's bad because they're too accepted. But anyhow, it is something we're interested in. We do a lot of that.
Yeah. Did you feel you were at the vanguard in some ways of that movement? And do you agree with Robert that in some ways perhaps it's gone too far?
Yes, I think there's no alternative to doing your homework, working hard at the specific situation where you are, because we helped to save and then restored the Fisher Library, which is the furnace building at Penn. But just behind it, we supported their demolition of what was called the Smith Building. Yeah. And we knew from our studies of the plan that the best place for a big new life sciences lab was right there, right on the other side of the Fisher Library, the furnace building. And there was a lot of outrage at Penn when we said, you really do need that building to be there, but we could show why. We said it put many other buildings at risk if they didn't put it there, because the linkages from the medical center in the direction of that building would have threatened many buildings along the path if there had been the need to go from the medical center further in that direction, further to the west and south.
So again, the answer is complex and contradictory. You cannot be a fanatical preservationist, but you must be a sensitive preservationist, and it is very, very complex.
And it's hard. I mean, you have to do your homework, as you say.
Exactly.
But that brings me to another question, I guess both specific and general, which is has to do with, I suppose, a tendency I tend to associate with postmodern architecture. I don't know whether I should use that term, but architecture today, that there is a tendency perhaps to super theoretical approaches and to ideological or doctrinaire approaches where, it's not about so much about context but it's about having a policy or a doctrine. And I wonder if you've seen that and if you've had to work against that to some extent in your career, because you seem very much not of that.
Well, the early modernists were pretty doctrinaire, and then the late modernists maybe even more so. And now, yes, there can be doctrinaire preservationists, and there can be doctrinaire green architects. It may be more to do with personality than with the subject. Okay. And there's something in the training of architects that tends to lead them to be doctrinaire.
Why is that?
I think that sometimes the jury system, which was inherited from the French Beaux-Arts training, tends to be over-harsh, and it makes people then repeat that sort of pattern themselves when they train other students, and it brings out authoritarian personalities, basically.
Ideology is dangerous in art and in life, and you must acknowledge that everything has to be taken and worked in a pragmatic way, and that's a great tradition in America.